Today we are joined by Harold Ford Jr., a former U.S. representative. According to Bill Clinton, he is the living embodiment of where America ought to go in the 21st century.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
During your 5 terms in Congress, your focus was on results. After serving on both the Financial Services and the Budget Committees, what results did you hope to achieve?
The Budget Committee, first of all, thanks for having me, and delighted to be here. Delighted to be at the university. The Budget Committee has responsibility for reviewing the President's submission to Congress for the funding of the various agencies within government. I always believe that that fiscal responsibility was a smart thing for a couple of reasons. When government manages its affairs right, it's sort of a trickle-down effect and forces business and, for that matter, the private sector to behave differently as well. The more fiscal responsibility you have, the stronger our currency is and the stronger our standing is around the globe, I think. Today, as you probably know, we have almost a $500 billion debt we're expected to accumulate this year, which is an enormous number. The next president's going to have not only war spending to deal with, new spending initiatives that we need at home on infrastructure and other things, including education and health care. So my focus all the time on the Budget Committee was to try to keep the Bush administration in check. And as you recall, the war had really just started. And each year, Congress or the President would ask for Congress to fund the war, in other words, pass the bills to pay for the war. But we never ever included the money that we spent on the war. We never calculated or factored that into the budget. It was almost like the way Enron ran their books. They had a bunch of off-balance sheets. We do the same thing at the federal level, which is why our deficit is so big. Our war spending is never calculated or factored into our budget. So one of the things I fought hard for, and we fought hard in the committee, was to do just that. In the Financial Services Committee, probably the biggest thing that happened when I was there was Enron, the collapse. And we passed a new set of regulations that's been commonly called Sarbanes-Oxley. Some people call it SOX. It really calls for greater transparency in how these companies operate, calling for greater independence with those who serve on their boards. There's some parts of it that Wall Street and many in the private sector did not like. They thought it was too onerous. But I think it's a good thing when CFOs and CEOs have to sign their financials. Because if you and I buy a share of stock in a company that one of these people here is CEO, CFO of, we are basically relying on the data they put out to us, saying the company's performing X, Y, and Z way. And if they are not asked to sign on to it, or at least to be responsible for it, or accountable for it, who should be? You and I buy the stock, and if it loses money, you and I can tell right away if we win or lose. If the stock goes up, we make money. If the stock goes down, we don't. But they should be held accountable if the data they're laying out for us is not true.
I'm so happy you brought that up with the upcoming elections and with the war. According to the New York Times, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the Consumer Price Index of this past August is 4% higher than it was a year ago. It's one of America's major concerns that this price index is going to keep raising. In your opinion, what needs to be done to solve this recurring problem?
Well, if you look at America's short history, it's only 232 years, and you look at the last 50 to 75 years where we've had, or the last 100 years, we've had periods of economic growth. You had an industrial revolution, you had an information technology revolution that really transformed the way our economy operated. I mean, we were an agrarian economy, then an industrial economy, a manufacturing economy. Now, technology has gripped so much and really has reshaped the way we think about just about everything we do. It was a time when computers were used for one thing. You can't go into a fast food chain and order a sandwich or order a hamburger or a cheeseburger without technology dominating. And there was a time when you could pull up at a window and they'd write it down and pass the order back. Now it's all computerized and mechanized. So I think the way you address those numbers and you get America back on the right path is we now have to find this sort of next growth phase. I happen to agree with a lot of people that it's really in creating these, what they call these green collar jobs. I think that as we develop and find and diversify our energy portfolio in the country, as we find new energy sources, we'll create new jobs. We'll create new opportunities. And America is at its best when it's creating jobs. If we're not creating good paying jobs, we don't grow. And that's the only way you address these challenges. The last several years, there's a lot of blame to go around for what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years with our economic challenge we find ourselves in. You get people buying homes that they probably should not have bought. You had people using their homes as ATM machines, and banks and Wall Street and the individuals were all profiting in big ways. Because if you owned a $300,000 house and it appreciated to $600,000, you went and took all the money out when you probably should not have done that. The bank should not have been encouraging people to do that. Everybody's at fault because you got the extra $200,000 or $300,000 out of your home, and the bank was able to is still charging you and is trying to recoup some of that money. You can't have paper wins like that. In short, you have to create jobs. We have to do things and people have to be employed for the country to grow. And when that's not happening, the country doesn't grow. So I think that's what you address. The next president's got to figure out how he launches us on sort of a new path that will help create new jobs. And I think energy and finding new energy sources presents the best chance to do that.
Speaking of energy sources, America's dependence on oil is a major concern in the 2008 election. How do you think it's best to free us from this dependence?
Well, two things. One, you and I are the first generation of Americans ever to send people to war and pay for our enemy to try to kill them while they're overseas. Every time we buy or fill up our car, we're doing that. I mean, we are transferring wealth at a level, at a rate unseen in the history of man. You know, we've transferred a few $1 trillion in wealth from democratic nations to undemocratic nations, to nations with what we call petro-dictators. We're at war because of our appetite for oil. I happen to think the nation will be more secure, will create more jobs, and will slow the harmful effects of global warming if we begin in a serious way to look for new energy. And the next president can't just talk about it. This president we have now has done more talking than he actually has done acting. Democrats are going to have to understand it. We're probably going to have to drill a little bit more, drill some in the short term. And Republicans are going to have to come to understand that we're going to have to make some big investments in wind and solar and tidal and the renewable energies that, frankly, we have an abundance of. Wind and solar present some unique opportunities. And I just believe when America's ingenuity gets behind something, we can accomplish anything. And if the next president is serious about diversifying our energy sources, then he's going to have to put the money behind it and really lay out, I think, a series of challenges to the country. There's no challenge we've not been able to meet. And if you say to every university in the country, including this great university, that we're going to lay out a series of challenge grants for those who can come up with new ways to heat our homes, new ways to air condition our churches and places of worship. We're going to find new ways to farm. I mean, most people don't realize that cars and automobiles and trucks don't account for the majority of our pollution in this country. And for that matter, that the majority of the problem we face with global warming globally. It's a variety of things, including how we farm, where we farm, the appliances that we use. I was thinking there was a sink over there, but the appliances that we use, the light bulbs that we use. I mean, we can radically transform we can reduce our dependence on oil and at the same time create more jobs, slow the effects of global warming, and prevent ever having to send another soldier anywhere around the globe to defend our appetite for oil.
Originally in 2003, you voted for the Iraqi war and said that more Democrats should be supportive of it. Then in 2005, you wrote Bush a letter with your concerns about the White House's intelligence on the ongoing war. And then you followed it with a list of recommendations, one being to build schools and hospitals in the Middle East, to announce permanent military bases in Iraq, and to achieve democracy like in the U.S. After this letter, and with these recommendations and our need of oil, do you believe that it's necessary to be doing these things over there when our economy needs the money just as well?
Two things, or a couple of things. You do some good research, by the way. In 2003, when we voted in Congress authorizing the use of force, I don't think most people thought that the president would go to war as he did. You remember, give you a little context. When we voted on that, Colin Powell had gone before the UN and laid out the case. Right before that, Colin Powell had engineered a 15-0 vote within the UN Security Council to readmit the inspectors back into Iraq, the weapons inspectors. And many of us thought that this was a license for the president to use and exhaust every diplomatic asset at his disposal. And if that failed, then, and if the weapons inspectors found weapons and and Saddam was unwilling to relinquish them, then the president would have the authority to use force. Second, part of that letter to the president was, it's clear that our intelligence was not right because they had no weapons. It's obvious that the weapons inspectors actually had it right. Bush disputed the weapons inspectors and discredited them, essentially. And my letter to him was, how do we ensure we don't make the same mistake? Because we now are embroiled in something that we can't just get up and leave from. As much as I'd love for the war in Iraq to end tomorrow or next week or next month, it's not. And what I want to do is try to prevent us from ever undertaking an exercise like this again based on flawed intelligence. Remember, we weren't the only ones with this intelligence. You had our friends in Europe, you had friends in the Middle East, who all believed that this guy had weapons of mass destruction. So it's easy now to say what should have happened, how it should have happened. I should have voted this way, should have voted that way. I don't know. I mean, some people said, do you apologize for it? I don't apologize for a vote where I thought that I thought the president would interpret differently. And if I knew now, I think if the country knew now, knew then what we know now, that this guy had no weapons of mass destruction, the bill probably would have never been brought for a vote, and if it were, it would have failed, almost unanimously. Because the only reason that I thought we should be willing to use force in Iraq is because I thought this guy had weapons of mass destruction. And right after September the 11th, with what bin Laden had achieved, I thought that it was feasible that bin Laden and Saddam Hussein could marry their resources. Now, there's a lot of hatred between the two of them because of where they come from, but their hatred for America, I thought, might supersede whatever hatred they may have for one another.
And that makes a lot of sense, but with our government today...
Oh, to your question, I'm sorry, to your question about what I was trying to say in the letter to them was, look, if we really want to change their way of governing, really want to introduce democracy there, you have to give people in that country something to hold America up positive for. And if we're going to spend all of this money fighting, sending more and more troops, we ought to look at spending some of this money to help give these people the tools to build their own lives. Because it'd be great if 10 years from now, 15 years from now, kids in that country say, you know what, I went to a school that was built by Americans. It makes them less likely to hate us. It makes it less likely that they want to do harm to us if they see us as being partners and a part of their fabric. If the only imprint in the memory they have of Americans is them bulldozing through their community, that's a pretty searing memory to have and something that you may hold against this country. That's why I often say the last 8 years at best, America's standing in the world is misunderstood. At worst, we've seen our stature diminished greatly from Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, to the way we've gone about prosecuting the war in Iraq, to a president who has made clear that he'd rather go it alone, even if finding partners was feasible. We've got to change that. And I like President Bush personally, but I think he's been an awful president. And I think his legacy in Iraq, and legacy of that matter in the Middle East, America's legacy, the next president's is going to have his hands full trying to figure out how we clean it up. I think it's doable. I think it's achievable. And I think some of we're going to have to spend even more resources, just to continue to spend resources in that region of the world. Your question about whether we should be doing it here, clearly we ought to be building things here and employing people here and finding new ways to do things here. But we find ourselves embroiled in this mess now, and we've got to figure out how we clean it up. And I say mess, not the lives that have been lost have and the people who've sacrificed, that they should not be honored. And so we find ourselves in a mess just to what we've created over there, and we've got to now figure out how we undo some of that and clean some of it up and give the Iraqi people a chance to govern themselves and us a chance to begin to pull back even more.
In this mess and in this midst of elections, who do you believe will not only help the Middle East, but our country as well?
I think that it's a tired phrase, but I think it needs to be followed. We got to let the circumstances on the ground determine what we do when whoever's elected president, and I think both of them will do that. I do think that the circumstances on the ground will probably allow for us to begin to reduce our footprint there. I think we've got to change our mission there. Our mission should be 2 or 3 things. One, to help train Iraqi forces to protect themselves and defend themselves. 2, to ensure that you don't have a rise and Al-Qaeda doesn't have a resurgence there. And 3, to help the feuding political factions there find some common ground to sort of begin the process of building a government. We have to realize in America, You know, it took us a while to get our country going right. I mean, we had a civil war after we wrote the Constitution. After the country was birthed, it took about 10, 11 years to get the Constitution right or get that written. So as we think about our democracy, think about it, it's only been a few years there in Iraq. Now, I think we went about it the wrong way. But I do think that Senator Obama, if he's elected president, a year from now, we will see a smaller footprint, probably somewhere between 30 to 40,000 fewer troops in Iraq. The irony is that those troops will probably be shifted to Afghanistan, and we'll have to help maintain some peace there, or might even be shifted to other parts of the region, including finding ways to ensure that there's the situation in Pakistan does not spiral out of control. So we'll have a footprint there for a while. The question is whether or not we reduce the casualty level, and the second question is whether or not the Iraqis begin to govern on their own.
Well, it's sure going to be an interesting election this year. Again, I want to thank you for coming in. We really appreciate all the time you spent with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.